Folks, we are still here in the Ways and Means Committee room. It is someday in the month, Friday. And we are going to continue our testimony from yesterday with John about the governor's proposed education transformation plan, tax edition.
Awesome. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. Happy Friday. We're here again. Let's see if I can screen share. So yesterday we made it to page 12, I believe. So I'm just gonna jump back in where we left off, unless you guys would like me to reorient or walk through any. Cool. So this section may be relatively quick. We're just talking about conforming revisions at these pieces. So we're still in Title 32. I may not talk much about some of these changes just because they're removing terms that are no longer useful. But I will try to scroll slowly so that you can check and see if there's anything that stands out to you, but I'll call out these changes. If there's anything that is not conforming or seems to be more substantive, I will call it out to you. But here, for instance, at the bottom, removal of non-homestead, because we're not now talking about a uniform rate that applies across both homestead and non-homestead, so you don't need to distinguish between the two. Similarly, at the top of the next page, removal of technical terms that are no longer needed to be distinguished. So again, just conforming changes here. We are on page 13. I did want to call out this amendment to section 5410G. This is language that currently imposes penalties. Basically, if folks are attempting to game the system by classifying or not designating their property as non-homestead. For instance, if your non-homestead rate was lower than your homestead rate, you would be incentivized to not make that declaration, even though you're required to do so. And so we currently have in law a provision that's meant to impose penalties for fraudulent attempts to pay lower rates. Essentially, you don't need to have this section anymore if you just have a uniform rate across the two, but that's what this big deletion is. Existing law is imposing a penalty and trying to deter folks from gaming the different rates.
And someone remember to ask the tax department if they've ever used that penalty. Thanks. Okay.
I'm trying to remember.
Thank you.
It used to happen. I don't remember this ever being implemented against anybody, but people made an honest mistake. They didn't know they had to either declare or not.
And I think we've taken a lot of testimony about the honest mistakes. And I regularly hear from members who are like very aware of people who are purposefully making decisions.
Uh-huh. Okay.
And just to call, in existing law, there are distinctions between honest and fraudulent attempts. Those that are not deemed fraudulent are subject to this 8% penalty, but those that are considered fraudulent intent, the penalty is 100% of the education tax department. So it's quite supportive.
Representative Higley, did you help here?
I did, I guess. Do you know the number of towns that currently their non-residential rate is actually lower than their residential?
I am not the person who knows, and I may never know the answer to that. That's something for probably JFO or maybe.
My understanding is that because it's sort of it's if you're above the average spending or below the average spending is why you do one or the other. So it's in the perimeter of 50%.
I heard it was somewhere around 60 towns or so a few years back. I just was curious as to, because again, if people talk about, you know, that residential rate versus a non-residential, but there are some towns that.
Yes, have the opposite. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and Julia can talk about that next time she's here.
My calculation was 80.
Cool. So this next piece, we're out of the conforming revision section. There will still be conforming revisions here, but this is a substantive proposal here. This is repealing the existing property tax credit and then introducing a homestead exemption. I think that this concept is likely familiar to you guys. I know that you've had Jake Feldman from the tax department to come in and talk about proposals related to the PTC. So hopefully this will be familiar, but just to walk through some of the language that could accomplish that. This first piece you see here is just, we set out statutory purposes for any exemption. From from taxation. And so here are some cleanup changes in the first section, but to call out this, the statutory purpose of this new homestead property tax exemption, which is intended to replace the existing property tax credit, is to reduce property tax liability for households with low and moderate household income. So you can think of as income sensitivity measures. That's what this sort of thing is. And we're replacing what is the existing income sensitivity measures through the PTC.
Madam Chair, if I can, this to me is something I don't completely understand. And can you help me understand that particular change? What is that?
Yeah, we'll come to the actual, so
Okay.
let me jump down to the actual big change, because this is just setting out the statutory purpose. Each time an exemption or a credit is included, we list in statute what the designated purpose of that thing is. So this is just spelling out what the thing is, but we'll
Okay.
actually come to the concept down here.
Thank you.
So now we're talking about chapter 154, which is our under existing law, that's your homestead property tax credit and renter credit chapter. This is being proposed to be replaced with a homestead property tax exemption while retaining the existing municipal property tax credit and renter credit. So removing the existing education property tax credit, which is what we typically think of when we're talking about income sensitivity measures related to the education property tax. But as you know, in this chapter, we also have that municipal property tax credit and a renter credit. Both of those are retained in this proposal, but now instead of that education property tax credit, we have a homestead property tax exemption. And the conceptual thing that's happening is you're reducing the amount of the house site value that is subjected to education property taxation. That's the big concept here, and I can walk through the actual language. This is just cleanup at the top to make clear that it's now just a municipal property tax credit, no longer the broad reference to both an education property tax credit and a municipal property tax credit. This language you see deleted at subdivision 8 is just a cleanup change. I searched through this whole chapter to find any instance of the phrase annual tax levy, and it doesn't exist as far as I know. So I think this is just holdover language that has not been cleaned up in years. Which is another thing that's nice about, there are many things that are not nice about walking through big proposals overall, the whole system. Having the chance to clean up a bunch of archaic language and fix things that have been messy for years is pleasant, if tedious.
So
So is the renter credit, does that remain a credit or is
That
that?
remains a credit. Yep, that remains in this. I did want to call out, even though this text isn't amended, just to, you guys will be familiar with this term, but house site, just to distinguish from homestead. As you know, under existing law, the property tax credit is determined based on the house site, which is your homestead plus the 2 acres surrounding or up to 2 acres for a non-multi-unit dwelling and up to 10 for a multi-unit dwelling. But it's basically the necessary land around your principal dwelling that's included with your house site. So it's a smaller portion than homestead, which is your dwelling plus all of your land within the parcel. The house site is just your dwelling plus the necessary land around it, up to 2 acres for a single dwelling unit and up to 10 for a multi-dwelling unit. Under existing law, the house site value is used to determine the property tax credit, but that is applied against a property tax liability that is determined on your homestead. So your calculation is based on house site, but applied to homestead for the existing PTC. For the exemption, you have an alignment here. You're determining the value based on the house site. And so you're just taxing on. It's going to be easier once I get down to the actual pieces, but I want to make clear that the house site is different from homestead. And here there's a bit cleaner references to house site that exist in existing law where you have this divergence. Claim year in which your claim is filed. I'll call out the taxable year is the preceding year. It's the year preceding the year in which you filed your claim. New defined term for homestead property tax exemption. That's what's created. That's the big proposal that's in this chapter. It's the reduction in the amount of your house site value. So not your homestead, it's the reduction in just the dwelling plus those surrounding necessary land up to 2 acres. That's subject to the statewide education tax and the school district spending tax. So it is important to call out the exemption would be available for both that statewide tax and that local tax, that school district approved budget. Your house site value would also be used to determine an exemption from that particular rate as well. So it's not only applicable to your statewide rate, it's also applicable to school district spending tax, which is specific to a particular school district. Cleanup changes here in 6062, just getting rid of gendered language. Similar cleanup type changes here in section 6063. These are just provisions that deal with what happens upon an owner's death. Does that transfer in the same way? This maintains the current path. So if the claimant dies after having filed a timely claim, that municipal property tax credit and homestead exemption will travel to the estate, stays with it. That's just like current practice. So I would call this a conforming change, but just to make clear why you're getting the language here. Okay, so subsection B, this is something I want to draw your attention to. So you'll see in the case of a sale or transfer of a residence, what happens with property taxes? How are we assigning credits and exemptions upon the sale of a home? As I have heard, although I don't know so much about the situation, oftentimes new purchasers are not availed of the benefits of the property tax credit in the year in which they may be receiving liability. So in part, this is an attempt to get at that particular situation and ease the burden on new purchasers. So in the case of a sale or transfer of residence after April 1 of the claim year, any municipal property tax credit will be allocated to the transferor unless otherwise negotiated. That's like current law. That's the way that it currently works, is the property tax credits are assigned to the seller under existing law. And then basically a purchaser would need to negotiate with the seller if they wanted to receive that particular benefit. The new pieces that apply here are at the top of page 17, any homestead property tax exemption. So that's your exemption that will come to the calculation shortly, but it's determined based on your income. It's an income sensitivity measure. Any homestead property tax exemption related to that residence based on the transferor's age and household income shall cease to be in effect upon transfer. So the transferor, the seller, is going to lose that particular exemption upon transfer. And then under subdivision 3, a transferee, so the person purchasing the house or receiving the house, however it might be delivered to them, the transferee who is eligible to declare the residence as a homestead, but for the requirement to own the residence on April 1 of the claim year. So they didn't own it at that time, but they are the one that is getting into that house, may be eligible to apply for a homestead property tax exemption when the transfer occurs by filing this homestead declaration and a claim for the exemption on or before the due date prescribed under section 6068 of this chapter. That is the due date for your income tax return. So I can't speak so much to the calendar as to how much benefit actually a purchaser would receive in this case, but conceivably this is a happier circumstance for purchasers under this new proposal. Basically, it's saying your exemption for the transferor, the seller, expires upon that transfer, and the person purchasing can apply for that exemption if they meet a specified deadline and can avail themselves of that homestead property tax exemption in that year, whereas they might have had to wait till the next year under the current proposal to receive any benefits.
And what is that deadline? Is it September?
I don't know what the income tax return deadline is. It may be April 15th. I'm not sure. So I
Yes,
wonder what the,
it's a tax day.
Oh, okay.
So does that mean there's 2 weeks?
so one, I don't think there's a way to describe it that way because we're talking about if you didn't own it prior to on April 1 of the claim year. But I think oftentimes people are in negotiations or the sale hasn't occurred. So it's, you know that it's in the pipeline, right? You could be receiving a benefit for multiple months, I would say, under this proposal that you can't receive under existing law. But it does, the way that I read this, if we're using that April 15 date is, yes, there are many people, purchasers later in the year who would not receive this particular benefit.
So it reads April 1 of the claim year shall.
Mhm.
And then, but you said may. So is that depending on if they're eligible?
Yeah, exactly. So they shall be eligible to apply, but whether or not they do receive it, if they meet the deadline, right, they would have to meet their conditions they have to meet to receive this. It's probably as simple as meeting the deadline. But the reason I said may is just that they do have to fulfill particular conditions, but they are eligible. Under law, they shall be eligible.
Right. So it doesn't say may up there. You just used that word.
Yes, yes. And my apologies if I, caused confusion.
And to follow up on the April 15th question, if someone files an extension on their income taxes to September 15th.
Good question.
Yeah, I
Nod.
That's a good question. And I think anytime calendar questions come up, I think that they're good questions, and maybe in part, I think they're good questions because I think it's awfully hard to keep track of all the calendars and we have this many moving parts. I think it's really useful to have,
You seen our chart?
gosh, I can try to read it from here, but
It's
I have a good
calendar year, revenue forecast year, state fiscal year, school year, income tax year, federal fiscal year, and property tax year. Because they don't all line up. That's what the color coding is.
yes.
And I think one thing we're gonna need to do as we pull these bills together is make some nice calendar diagrams to make sure that things are lining up.
Yes, and I am not there yet, but I will try to get to a position where when I see statutory references or people talk about particular deadlines, they're intuitive to me and I can say that this is before that, this is after that. I'm not quite there yet. There's so many dates. I will get there. Next pieces are conforming type changes. So just saying that forms that come out from the tax department need to accommodate this new exemption and municipal property tax credit. So I'll go relatively quickly through these pieces and let me make sure I'm picking up any handwritten notes that I have. Yeah, these are just flow through conforming updates. Let me come down to the actual meat of the exemption. So section 6066, this is on page 18. This is where we find our existing property tax credit. So you're seeing repealed here, the existing property tax credit, and it's being replaced by this homestead property tax exemption. This is what we're talking about when we talk about income sensitivity measures. So this is the new income measure is the way that I would describe this. Repealing all of the education property tax credit pieces here. And then starting at the bottom or midway through page 19, this is the creation.
When you say all, is the circuit breaker?
Circuit breaker for the municipal property tax credit remains.
Thank
You
you.
don't need a circuit breaker for the education property tax credit because you now have this homestead exemption, but that's right, the
Okay.
municipal circuit breaker remains. So eligible claimant who owned the homestead on April 1 of the claim year shall be entitled to a homestead property tax exemption in the claim year in an amount determined as follows. Basically, these subdivisions set up the conditions, the income sensitivity measures that determine the value of the exemption that you can receive. All of the provisions that you're going to see here, A, B, C, D, are based on income, but there's something special about the first subdivisions A and B. They also incorporate an age piece. So looking at subdivision A, bottom of page 19, for a claimant whose household income is equal to or less than $47,000 and who is 65 years of age or more as of December 31 of the year in which the claimant's household income is taken into account. That's the taxable year. That would be the year preceding the year in which the claim is filed. So someone who is 65 years or older and has 47K or less in household income is entitled to an exemption of 70% of the claimant's house site value, not homestead, but house site value, provided the exempt amount of house site value shall not exceed $200,000. So what this means is someone who meets these particular categories is only going to be facing a property tax liability on 30% of the house site value up to receiving a 200K exemption. And the point at which that happens, which you can take 200,000 and divide by 0.7 to get this figure, is around $285,000. So above that point, you're not receiving an additional house site, any additional house site exemption value. But up to that figure, you can receive a quite substantial house site exemption up to an exemption of 200K. It's the same concept for each of these with different triggers that cause it. So I will pause here if there's a question as to how mechanically that works. And I can just restate slowly again the basic concept, which is you're receiving an exemption of your house site value, not the homestead value. So it's that dwelling plus, up to 2 acres around it. You don't have to face 100% of your tax liability on the house site value. You're just facing, in this case, if you meet these conditions, 30% of the house site value until you breach 285K in house site value.
And when Jake came in and walked us through this, he had those charts, and maybe this only helps to bring my own brain, but I'll attempt it for you. I have a lot of visual memory. It was a chart where he had sort of it was a grid of incomes and house site values, and there was green and red, and there was a lot of red where sort of Sort of the vast middle seemed to have a little bit more liability. Lower income people had less liability than before. And next week, Julia's going to come in and present sort of another iteration of that. That turns a little more of the red to green in very layman's terms. But yeah.
So, I'm assuming that, currently we fill out an HS 122 for that. Would there be a similar form for this as well that would follow, our person that did our taxes, let's say?
I don't know what the form would be. That might be a question for the tax department. Yeah. But I assume that the process will be, my understanding is that the genesis for this is that this is also meant to be simpler than the existing system. So I don't want to speak for that.
And then if I can interject at this point, is this when that proposal of maybe having a deferral process is also going to be implemented?
Is that somewhere in here?
I don't know about that.
Oh, interesting. That's not in here.
Can you say more?
Oh, sorry. So Jake came in and talked us through how a bunch of other states allow folks with homesteads to defer some percentage of their property taxes
Oh,
to some future
okay.
state that I think we all assumed was part of the proposal.
We heard the proposal and the rationale was that under this exemption type of thing, certain very low income property owners, but with high value properties would still get hit very hard in terms of taxes. And so the suggestion was to allow a deferral of the taxes due to a later date
Right.
for that small segment or maybe
So,
a large segment.
But you don't have any legislative language on that.
I don't recognize that.
Okay.
I will look at.
But we will,
No,
Yes.
tax will look into it and
Sure.
we will hear from them. Thank you.
I think it was just a proposal, right? It wasn't anything that was actually considered at this point, right? I mean,
Well, I think he was suggesting it as a solution to that problem that might come if you use this exemption proposal, because there would be a certain segment of the
Mhm.
low income but high property value folks who might be negatively affected by going to this as opposed to the income sensitivity.
Yeah,
And I think in any case, it's not in here, and so we'll figure out where it is if we want to put it somewhere or not, or not, yeah, no. I'm also feeling we're not at this moment. Representative Burkhart and then Brannigan.
Apologies if I missed this. What was the logic behind the age restriction on this?
I don't know. And just to restate what I said yesterday, this is something that the Department of Tax put together. And that may be part of why this particular provision is missing, is that two things I think were going on: the development of the broader education proposal, which included AOE, Department of Tax and the like. And then I know that Department of Tax individually has been, pursuing these revisions to the PTC. So it may just be that that was part of that train of thought and wasn't brought along with the education transformation proposal. But I don't know what the thinking was with including an age eligibility condition. That would be for tax to. So just to walk quickly through the next ones, they work instrumentally the same way. Same income threshold for subdivision B, but in this case, this is for folks less than 65 years of age. That exemption would be 60% of the house site value. You would exhaust that house site value exemption, meaning you would receive no more additional benefit, basically above a house site valued at 333K, something along those lines. Under subdivision C, we have a different income tier. So this is your 47,000 to up to, it doesn't go all the way to 90. It's actually less than 90,000 to get 50% house site value exemption. This would be for you would stop receiving an additional house site value exemption above 400K. And then for this subdivision D, we're talking about incomes between 90 and 125K. It's only a 10% exemption afforded for folks in this income category. And so you would exhaust that house site exemption at a $500,000 figure, but you'd just be accruing that exemption quite slowly relative to how quickly folks in the lower income tiers would receive that house site exemption. Above 125,000, no house site value exemption would be available. So that is the proposed replacement for the existing property tax credit. As the chair identified, the municipal circuit breaker still exists. That's what you're seeing here in subdivision 2. So I won't walk through that. That's what current law is. That's just maintaining this provision. We no longer include, or this proposal no longer includes subdivision 4, which was the education equivalent of the circuit breaker, because now you have the outright exemption rather than an additional credit. Some clarifying language at subdivision 3 here on page 21. This is, I think, consistent with the way the law currently works, with pointing out that the exemption won't reduce the house site value below 0, and the municipal property tax credit shall not exceed the amount of the reduced municipal property tax credit. So attempting to floor those at 0, basically the whole of your property tax liability or house site value should not be exceeded. We can delete the language that's included here at the final line because we no longer have this education property tax circuit breaker. We now just have the exemption. Some conforming changes here at the bottom of C. What I did want to call out, this is how existing law works, but just so you guys are clear, to be eligible, the claimant must have been domiciled in the state during the entire taxable year. So just calling out, that's consistent with existing law, but just so you know, you have to have been around for the whole preceding year, the year preceding the claim filed. There's some other conditions, but I don't think they're as important to draw attention to, particularly given the 3 minutes we have left. So let me see. I think a lot of it.
We have more than 3 minutes,
Okay,
unless you only have 3 minutes.
No, I can say.
Okay. Are you sure?
Yeah, it's all good. A lot of this is just what you're seeing here, cleanup changes at the bottom of this page. Yes. So we have some technical provisions in existing law that are meant to get at the ways that folks indirectly currently pay property taxes, right? So if you live as part of a mobile home park or you're part of a cooperative, you may be indirectly paying property taxes through the funds that you provide to that cooperative or the like. So we have provisions in law that allow for the allocation of portions of that property tax that you're indirectly paying to be applied against your liability. So these are technical changes here to ensure that we're picking up the exemption. And so the way that this works here at the bottom of page 22, a co-op member who is the house site owner shall be entitled to a property tax credit in an amount determined by multiplying the property taxes allocated under the subsection by the percentage of the exemption for which the house site owner's household income qualifies under that exemption. Basically, what this means is you will have indirectly paid some property tax credits. So what you're getting now is an outright credit against that payment that you made. And the way that it's determined is by taking the allocated property taxes, meaning the portion of the cooperative's property taxes that you paid, and multiplying it against those same exemption tiers. So if you were getting a 70% exemption under that subdivision A, you would take that same 70% figure and you would multiply it against your allocated taxes, and it would reduce that liability. You would receive that back. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah.
Very similar provisions here for, is this, yes, if your homestead is owned by a nonprofit corporation, surrounding lands, community land trust, same style provisions here. So taking your exemption and multiplying by any allocated property taxes that you face. This subdivision I, again, conforming changes here, just to call out what this is doing. The calculation of these exemptions is calculated ignoring particular provisions. This is consistent with existing law. I believe that the exemption under 380211 that you see here is related to veterans, and it's an exemption on like 10K of a household for veterans and widowers and the like. But this is consistent with existing law. This is a conforming change. That's what that is doing. 66A, more conforming type changes. We've already walked through the actual substance of the exemption, so you've kind of gotten you've gotten the heart of the proposal. This is just calling out that the commissioner shall determine the exemption and those municipal property tax credits on particular dates based on, this taxable year, crediting property taxes paid in the prior year The one thing I would call out here, and I'm sure that you guys talked through some of this with Jake from the Department of Tax. But as you know, under the existing system, there's this lag, right? You're applying a credit against your prior year property tax liability. Using this exemption, it's determined based on your income taxes for the last year, and it's using that house site value that you have available this year. So it's eliminating that lag, and that's part of what this language is saying.
That's a delightful thing. I just wanna like,
Yes.
I feel like I've not had said very many affirming things today. I love that. Yes.
I'm glad to be in the chair when people are happy.
Enjoy it.
Preferable for me. Other pieces of this are just conforming changes using the updated technical terms we have. And if you have questions technically about how these pieces work, the reason that you need in this section to add new terms, if you recall in prior section, we were eliminating distinctions between homestead and non-homestead, and that's because we were applying a uniform rate. The reason that you're seeing throughout updates to call out the homestead property tax exemption and the municipal property tax credit is we need to distinguish now between an exemption, which is different from a credit, and a credit that you're receiving. So sometimes we're allocating an exemption or we're applying a credit. That's generally why you're seeing all this underlined text. But if folks have more technical questions, I'm happy to answer them. And if you're also, please feel free to email me on any particular things. Let me see. More conforming changes on the next page. So it's of the same sort that I've just talked through. We're removing references to the circuit breaker here. The education property tax circuit breaker, that was 66A3, that's been removed. But we do retain references to the municipal circuit breaker. These are just conforming changes here to pick up the new exemption and ensure that we still are maintaining that circuit breaker. Same conforming type changes here. I can slow down if folks want, but I think it's going to be awfully boring for me just to say that this is the new defined term. I will call out here, municipalities are to apply the amount of the homestead property tax exemption to current year property taxes across installments, and clarifying that the amount of municipal property tax credits allocated under this chapter can also be applied in equal amounts to each installment. I think that this is consistent.
Can or should be.
Shall be.
Okay, thank you.
I think this is consistent with the existing approach, and that there was a way to reference this generically under existing law, because we could just call out credit, and that captured both the education property tax credit and the municipal property tax credit. So the new language that you see here is, I would describe as a conforming change. I don't think this is a substantive update, but just making clear that those are applied across installments. Which makes me wonder about the deferral question, but I think that's beyond the scope of this. It just seems like the sort of thing that might fall into this area of law.
I didn't hear a lot of people loving the deferral, and it was a joint session.
Okay.
So I wouldn't get too troubled about it right now.
Let's see.
I don't want to speak for anyone too much, but okay, great.
I just calling out the point that I was making when I first introduced the concept of this exemption that's determined based on house site value. We now call in a reference to house site value here when we're talking about the homestead property tax exemption and municipal property tax credit shall be allocated first to current year house site value. Again, I think this is cleaner. This is aligning that determination with where you're actually valuing the house, basically. So this is, again, just more conforming changes, but making clear the point I was discussing earlier is picked up in statutory language here. I think we're in the home stretch of really just simple cleanup type changes. This is meant to be consistent with existing law, but only to make clear, because now we have a distinction between a credit and an exemption. Only one individual per household per taxable year shall be entitled to a homestead exemption claim, property tax credit claim, or both. So if anyone in the household picks up an exemption or a property tax credit, that municipal property tax credit, no one else within the household can do that. For dollar amount, you're seeing the removal of a cumulative credit greater than 5,600. So there's a limit imposed in existing law on the credits that you can receive. The reason that this is removed is now the broader education PTC has been, that statewide property tax credit has been removed, and you just have the municipal property tax credit. So you can stick with this $2,400 figure. Again, conforming changes throughout the remainder of this section, just making clear that we're picking up both exemptions and credit claims. Spells out your application and time for filing. There is I think it's a necessary change given this proposal, but a meaningful thing we're drawing attention to here, which is that there are penalties applied if you miss particular deadlines under existing law. So under existing law, if the claimant files a claim after October 15th, but on or before March 15th of the following calendar year, that property tax credit is reduced by $150, but not below $0. Because we're now making available an exemption rather than just a credit, you wouldn't be able to reduce that liability because the person isn't paying, right? They're receiving an exemption. What we see below is that if a claimant files and we're talking about subdivision 2, if a claimant files a homestead property tax exemption claim after October 15th, but on or before March 15th of the following calendar year, the claimant shall pay a penalty of $150 because you don't have available that liability to reduce with a credit. They've received an exemption, and so they would actually pay a penalty for that late homestead exemption claim. So I would say this is consistent with the current approach. This is how it would need to work mathematically if you're availing folks of an exemption rather than a property tax credit. But it is a choice as to whether you would want to impose penalties on folks for doing
I
this.
think there's a pretty consistent question about the penalty and the dates there that we've sort of gone back and forth with tax about. And I think it's worth revisiting again this year. Yeah.
I have a question, just a general question, but I see we're putting municipal property tax and school property tax together. Have they always been together?
Yes. So this specific section and this specific chapter has included the existing property tax credit, the large one that we typically think about when we just say PTC, that's what people are talking about. But there's always been a municipal property tax credit as well that's included. There's also been an existing circuit breaker that applied broadly across the state. And then there's also been a municipal circuit breaker, which is the fix for folks at, very lower than the lowest tier income. Those have always existed within this section, within this chapter together. And I think they're talked about together because it's the administration of the property taxes that's
Okay.
happening through
I
both.
knew the
the state.
municipal had existed a long time before Act 60 came along. But I didn't realize we had put both these taxes together.
Mhm.
And nobody gets confused by that?
I don't know if nobody gets confused. I'm sure people get confused.
Back to you, John.
Cleanup type changes here, removing non-gendered language. I think the remainder of this is entirely technical. I say that, but then I see a question mark on my page, so that means something to me. These are conforming changes. This is where I had a question mark, subdivision C. In any case in which a homestead is rented by a person from another person under circumstances deemed by the commissioner to be not at arm's length, so this is kind of like not market dealing, the commissioner may determine the rent constituting property tax for purposes of this chapter. My guess as to why this is repealed, I don't know the answer as to why this is repealed, but my guess is that because we're no longer distinguishing between homestead and non-homestead, we don't need to make this distinction anymore.
I think it's actually still an interesting question because it is, I'm curious to you, like,
Yep.
when I read this, I go to the definition of household income actually, and with
Sure.
escaping the definition of household income. Is this in the same section?
This is in the same chapter that's relying on household income, that's picking up that house site value and the like. So the way that I read this substantively now is that, folks are receiving a renter credit, or they're meant to receive, just as we talked about with cooperatives and mobile home parks and the like. We're meant to, or the current system envisions, and I think that this proposal also envisions ways of picking up those indirect costs, the indirect ways that people currently pay property taxes. So I read this as trying to get at, and when I see the reference to not at arm's length, instances in which folks are paying extra. Basically, they're paying a disproportionate amount of property taxes on their non-homestead because they're renting. And is trying to get at and account for the fact that someone's paying an inflated rate and they shouldn't suffer essentially the consequences of that. So that's the way that I read this, but I will say till today, I was unfamiliar that this even existed in law, so. But yeah, I think this is something where I had a question mark. It was not entirely obvious to me. I would guess it is for that reason, dissolving the distinction between homestead and non-homestead, just applying a uniform rate. But you could.
I think we should ask the tax department what their
It's still
intent
the case. Yeah, exactly. It's like the substance of concern is still the case, even if you dissolve that distinction. Cleanup changes for adopting rules, just using modern terminology. Amendment of certain claims. This might be something, again, we're asking the tax department, but thinking, I'm guessing this is not substantive, but another instance where I have a question mark. At any time within 3 years, under existing law, after the due date, a claimant filed a claim by October 15th, so by the timely file, may file to amend that claim with regard to house site value, under current law, house site education tax, house site municipal tax, and ownership percentage. I'm guessing this is intended as a conforming change, but it's feels a bit more substantive to me. Why can't you no longer amend your house site education tax? Is it just because there's a uniform rate? It's not varied across districts? I don't know. That's something I would.
Well, because it might be varied across districts, right?
Certain, so this
Yeah.
would. I am guessing this is intended just to pick up the statewide rather than the state, the school district specific tax. But, and I can also talk for any of these things. I'm also happy to talk to folks in the tax department to get clarity on this.
Okay.
More conforming revisions here to call out this big deletion that you see from monies in the ed fund. We currently make payments for that property tax credit out of the ed fund. With its removal, you no longer need this particular reference. Unorganized. For unorganized towns and gores, we currently have ways of addressing how taxes are meant to be administered within these municipalities. You no longer need reference to the tax spending adjusted and the like because you're not varying in this particular way. So these are unnecessary at this point. This is.
Our towns and gores, they were somewhere
They
else.
would.
I remember
Exactly.
them from
And-
earlier.
And in this case, they would just now be picked up just the way that any municipality within a.
District.
Exactly. So you no longer have a education property tax spending adjustment. You're not using a base rate to then determine
Correct.
the local rates. So these are just technical terms that have disappeared. You no longer need them to make the mechanics work, is the way I would describe it. More conforming changes here at the bottom, just to make sure that we're capturing both the exemption and the municipal property tax credit. We can't just reference credits anymore because we now have this exemption. Similarly, cleanup here at the bottom to make clear, we no longer need to have a remedy that compensates for the result of inaccurate classification of properties homestead or non-homestead for the purposes of a uniform rate that's applied across both homestead and non-homestead. Lastly, just some repeals and your effective dates. As you recall, I believe it was last year that the Education Fund Advisory Committee was set up. And this was intended to make proposals to address I don't think it's effective yet.
It was not intended to make proposals. It was intended to maintain.
Okay.
Check the system and should not be repealed.
So there we go. So part of this is removing this, thinking that the system has been fixed with this proposal.
System will never be fixed. It will always require people to pay attention to it.
So that means I'll have a job, which is good. Effective dates. The big overhaul and that property tax credit reform, including the new exemption, would take effect July 1, 2027. So consistent with the education transformation proposal timelines that you guys have seen. But again, I think just reminding ourselves of the calendar and tracking those will be.
And I remember something last year when we were doing a bunch of property tax changes that some of the effective dates needed to be when the tax year started and some of them needed to be before the tax year started. And so I hope we I think we have a good time with effective dates this year.
Yeah, it's gonna be very fun.
Representative
Just real quick, I didn't see unless I was sleeping, the provision in there where the money doesn't go to phase money, the down. It is in
It's
there?
something that we talked about yesterday and
okay.
I can find
No.
it.
That's fine. No, I just,
Okay. I think it's on page 7. I don't know why I think that, but.
Okay.
I can find it and send it to you.
Okay.
It's around 7 or 8, I think.
thanks.
We're gonna check with the treasurer about that section to see what it does with cash flows, right?
I think that would be healthy, because I actually don't think what we think is happening is actually what's happening.
But we'll,
I'd be good to know.
Okay.
thank you, everyone. We have our tax workshop in room 11. And then lots of independent work, track down details this afternoon, and